My thought this year was that we would do well to include within our series of lectures on the Wethersfield Institute a session on the Creed. It is something that we come to so often every time we say the Rosary, the Apostles' Creed, at Sunday Mass with the Nicene Creed. And yet my own suspicion is, now I could be wrong, but my own suspicion is that sometimes I feel like I'm in a race when people are saying the Creed, and that people are getting quickly to the end of it. And I understand that people pray at different speeds. On the other hand, it is really a remarkable part of our faith, of our prayer together at the Mass, of our personal prayer, and hence I think it's very valuable for us just to stop and ponder. We might, in fact, have been under the impression that virtually every religion is a religion in which there's a focus on faith, like our religion is when we focus on the Creed and in which we say, I believe. But of course that isn't true, and I think that this will give us, right here at the start, a way to ponder something that is really quite distinctive about our own religion. Think, if you will, about some other religions that you might know. Judaism, for instance, has a kind of creed, and it's called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, that the Lord our God is one God. There is a creedal aspect to it. There is a statement that is like our creed, that is important to the Jewish religion. And yet I don't think that that's primarily what the Jewish religion is. I think that the category within which Judaism understands itself is primarily law. When we think, for instance, of what is at the center of revelation for Judaism, it is Torah. And then, if you think of Torah as the center circle, there's another circle out in a set of concentric circles, and that's Nevi'im, or prophets. And then another circle out, and that's Ketuvim, or writings. But what that means for the Jew is that at the heart of the revelation given by God, and at the heart of the observance of religion, is knowing and keeping the law. This is absolutely central. And what the prophets do is not so much predict the future. I mean, they were sometimes given by God to know what it is that would occur, but that what the prophets do is not primarily disclose that. What the prophets do is primarily to point people back to the law and to remind them of their need to keep it. In fact, some of the prophets, as we saw 2 years ago in our series, knew how to give people a talking to if they weren't observing the law. The law is so central. And then the Ketuvim, the third part of it, the Psalms, the wisdom literature, the historical books, all of that, of course, is a record of the way in which God had delivered his great gift to his people of the law, and then had sent them untold numbers of prophets to remind them to keep it, and that the writings were a history of successes and failures in keeping it, and in the case of the wisdom books, a reflection on what is it that works when you keep the law, and what is it that fails to work when you do not keep it. I don't think, therefore, that the centerpiece of a Jewish understanding of religion is creed or belief, though they have a very short form of creed. I think that the real centerpiece is law, and keeping the law, and treating the law as the great gift, and so on. Supposing you were to go further afield, if we go in an historical direction to religions that are about equally old with Judaism, one could look at, for instance, Greek or Roman religions. And one still sees that in many practices of religion today that are not in any way religions of the book. But there you would find that what is primarily the case is ritual. Think of your own studies of Rome, your own studies of Greece, and there's no test about belief. Do you believe this or do you believe that? In fact, I don't think there could be. I do. I love reading about the Greek and Roman myths. Some of my own favorite projects, reading regularly the Odyssey or going back and reading the Aeneid. And I love all the stories. They're charming stories. But I think that the people at the time also found them charming stories. And it wasn't a question that anyone would be held to downs about, do you believe all the stories that are in the Odyssey? Do you really hold as true everything that happened in the Iliad? Are you really convinced and willing to die for what was determined and what was disclosed in the Aeneid or in any of the sort? It's not about belief. It's rather about ritual. And that even if you had a tremendous skepticism, even if you had a sort of a practical version of this which saw no particular relevance or truth claims, what you had to do to be a good practicing Roman or a good practicing Greek was to go through the ritual, to offer the sacrifice. It's part of what you find when you read the Odyssey or read the Aeneid. People come and they're going to offer sacrifice even to gods they don't know. In fact, that's a part of the story. The gods aren't truly universal. The gods are very much the gods of this land or that land, and that there are some who cross the normal frontiers, the Zeuses and the Heras, causing trouble to one another and to their disciples. But it's not a matter of do you believe in it. It's a matter rather of doing the ritual. And for most historians of religion and philosophers of religion, even the classification of Roman and Greek religions, they're called do ut des religions. I give something to the gods in the hope that the gods will give something to me. It's constant bartering. It's not a matter of belief. If you look to Islam, which is perhaps the religion which on the current world stage is making the greatest waves, especially by virtue of the enormous power of that culture and the way in which some parts of that culture have been radicalized, we're back to a vision of religion as law. And again, there's a short version of a creed, that Allah is one and that Muhammad is his prophet. And so there is something that's creedal, something that's identifying. And yet it's not primarily a list of the things that you believe. It is rather, do you keep the law? And specifically, do you keep the law as is understood in the Quran and as is proclaimed by the Imam? And there are various warring species of Islam. I won't try to get into it now. I don't think I'm competent to do that. But as I've tried to read in Islam and tried to understand it, I think much of what we're experiencing is not only the antipathy of a very firm set of adherence to Quranic law, but a real civil war in terms of what Quranic law requires, right? I mean, the reason why we've got so many confusing groups is that they have different understandings of what it is that the Quran requires them to practice. If you move further afield yet, if you go into Hinduism or Buddhism in particular, I suppose there's even question about whether it is a religion or whether it is a philosophy. I must admit, when I really get down to it and try to understand that, I think I'd vote for the fact that it's a philosophy. That is, I don't even think that it is primarily a religion, although there are religious Buddhists. But what they do is exercises that try to help them think and philosophize and even get beyond thinking. A few years ago, I had the occasion to go to Hong Kong for 3 weeks. It was wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was there as the guest of the Hong Kong Baptist University. What's the world coming to? The Baptists are inviting the Jesuits. But I was there largely as a philosopher, and I was supposed to be reading papers from the philosophers in their university. The ones who are trained in the West already understand what you need to do to get a paper published in a professional journal in the West. The ones who are trained in the East don't have a clue what you do to get published in a journal in the West. So I was there to kind of help them through that. But while I was there, I had occasion in the company of the one Catholic on their faculty who interestingly teaches Buddhism. His professional area of expertise, and he doesn't see a conflict because it's a philosophy more than a religion. But we got to be great buddies. In fact, he's a great evangelist because many of the students who know nothing about religion or about the Christian religion come to him because he's known to be a Catholic, and he makes any number of very interesting conversions. But one Sunday afternoon, he took me over to a Buddhist temple. It's my first and only time at a Buddhist temple. It's above ground, and it's got incredibly beautiful woods. It's the gift of the People's Republic of China to the citizens of Hong Kong. That's another whole story. If you think we've got political issues, they've got political issues. But what struck me is that in this Buddhist temple, beautiful woods and lovely stones, because the gift of the people of China to the gift of the people of Hong Kong, but nobody around. There were lots of little, you would think of them as side altars from a Catholic church, with big statues of the Buddha, pretty indistinguishable as far as I could tell. Gifts of fruit left for them, but nobody around. But you could hear a humming, and it wasn't the air conditioning. Instead, what it was the downstairs, he took me down, enormous auditorium, sat about 1,000 people, and there was a Buddhist nun, because they ordained their nuns, a Buddhist nun, head-shaved in thoroughly black outfit, flowing gown, teaching them to chant. She would sing something, they would sing it. She would sing that and a little more, they would sing it, in a language none of them understood. It was like going to a Latin, well, I won't get into that. But it was them teaching this, and then she'd break off in little fervorinos. The day I was there, it had to do with something about living temperately, that is, not restraining your desires. But the whole thing is a philosophy of enlightenment, learning to become self-forgetful, and singing these chants in the hope of organizing your mind so that you can think more clearly, or, to be a little bit more precise, learn to stop thinking and fade into the great pattern of the universe in which you realize your nothingness, and will learn to be temperate so as to restrain your desires, so that it will be easier for you to be temperate, for you to be more easily fading into the cosmos. It's not the worship of anything, and hence I don't think that it's, in the strict sense of the word, a religion. How about when you get to Hinduism? I don't know as much about Hinduism, but my understanding from what I do grasp about it is that it is like Roman religion in many ways. It's a matter of what you do. It's a matter of going through the ritual. And what I know of the Indian Jesuits, sometimes I wonder what's the difference between them and Hindus, but I'm not going to get into that either. But they're extremely eclectic. I mean, I must admit, when I've gone and been in the company of some from India who call themselves Christian, it's very hard for me to understand how they really have creedal commitments. Because the eclecticism, if I understand it right, the eclecticism of Indian thought includes everything. And it's mostly a matter of doing it and a way of life. I think that there are gods there, so I would call it a religion, and yet it's a polytheistic religion in which there are thousands of gods. Some Western Hindus whom I have met have a sense of a single transcendent God. There, I suspect that they're more interested in belonging to Western society with its stress on monotheism, as opposed to practicing authentic Hinduism. Let me bring an end to this part of it and get back to the creed. What I'm attempting to say in these opening remarks is that one of the distinctive aspects of Christianity is belief. Faith in something that we cannot see, and specifically in a God, a single God, who is triune, but that professing this faith and really believing it is a central and distinctive aspect of Christian religion, which distinguishes it from other religion, and that we would, in a way, I believe, deceive ourselves if we thought that that's what other religions were doing. I don't think that that's even what they're doing. They're doing law, they're doing ritual, they're doing do et des practices, they're doing a kind of philosophy, although very different from Western philosophy, etc., etc., and that it is really a distinctive thing within this religion of ours that what is absolutely crucial to it is that we believe something, and specifically believe in someone, and that we profess it regularly. Hence my focus on the creed when we think about what we're doing. that admittedly, even if we think that we're just sort of keeping up with the crowd at Sunday Mass and saying it, I must admit, I'll just tell you my own secret. I love the fact that I have the microphone at Mass. Not for the homily, I try to do my best, but for the creed. Because what I try to do, I must admit, is to slow it down. Because it's intended to be a prayer, and it's a little hard to be a prayer when it's that long and when it's making the various assertions that are indeed made in the Nicene Creed, and yet it's supposed to be a prayer. And it's supposed to be a prayer precisely because we do have this tremendous understanding that there is a God who really does hear us and know us and understand us and love us, but that what we must do in the course of our worship is indeed to profess that we believe in this God. There will be things that we need to do and some things we need not to do, so we also include, of course, a moral code, and we're mindful in the way in which we accept and appropriate the very heart of Torah, namely the great 10 words, that is the 10 commandments of Judaism, and that we believe that this is God's own special gift, and we honor it. And likewise, we have Jesus' commandments. So there are things that we must do and not do, so that we share. And there are various things that are rituals, and we know the importance of ritual. I'm so fascinated, of course, by Catholic ritual, especially when it is, as opposed to when it's deformed, but I won't get into that right now either. My point is that while it's important that we are engaged in the ritual of our worship, and it's important that we have the commandments, that is the point of the law, another important part is this notion of faith, and not just having the faith secretly in our hearts, but professing it and living according to it, so that what we understand is especially associated with the creed. The creed is our statement of it and is invariably liturgical. Admittedly, it can be done privately. So when we're saying our rosary by ourselves, but then we are doing the liturgy, it simply happens that we are doing it alone. Maybe we're saying the rosary with somebody and then it actually is public. But that these creeds, as they emerged, were intended as intrinsically liturgical. The Apostles' Creed, which we will get to at a certain later date and look at in its details, I'm not going to try to discuss its details tonight, but the Apostles' Creed is intended by the Church primarily as a baptismal liturgy. Just as the Nicene Creed, the one we say at Sunday Mass, is intended as part of worship and hence is at the center of our weekly worship. But they are both intended as liturgical. There were other creeds. So one thinks, for instance, about the great Athanasian Creed, associated with St. Athanasius, and especially associated with the liturgy of a council. The Athanasian Creed is a wonderful one. I won't have a chance during this series to do too much with it, but it's worthwhile looking up sometime on the internet, since we're now so internet savvy, and to look it up on the internet and to see it. And there's a long list of things that we profess. And then, of course, the really famous part of the Athanasian Creed, the anathemas on those who don't profess these things. But that's another thing. We don't use that too often in the liturgy now. Likewise, there are creeds that are associated with other councils. Paul VI, for instance, wrote what's called the Credo of the People of God, and it was associated with the Second Vatican Council. It's never found very much of a liturgical home, and so right now it exists mostly in books. You'd rarely hear it said. But the two that are so important to us are the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. Let's think not so much about the details of the Apostles' Creed for a minute, but rather to think about its baptismal liturgical orientation. That is, when the Gospel of Matthew, at the very end, records the words of Jesus at the time of his ascension, and he's giving his directions to his disciples, it's in chapter 28, verse 19, you will see that he tells them to go and to baptize all nations in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. In a way, this is Matthew's version of the Creed, namely, what it is that Jesus tells his disciples to do. To baptize them, that is, to do the act of baptism. And we should stop and think for just a minute, but I want to get back to the creedal aspect, to think for just a minute of why Jesus, at his farewell, that is, at the time of the ascension, returning to his Father, commissioning yet more formally the apostles now to be those who would preach his faith on earth. He tells them specifically that to make Christians, we must be baptized, that it is a sacramental act, a sign that people must go to in order to become Christians. And what that sacramental act is, of course, is yes, the pouring of water, yes, the administration of the healing oil, but it's also answering 3 questions. We still see this in our baptismal liturgies now. If you've been recently to the baptism of perhaps some little one, or if you were witnessing a baptism at the Easter Vigil, at the center of the baptismal liturgy is a set of 3 questions. Do you believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth? Do you believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son? Do you believe in the Holy Spirit? And the answer to those 3 questions must first be, yes, I believe, before the baptism is administered, before the water is poured or the person is actually placed beneath the waters, before the healing oils are applied. That is, what the act of baptism is already the occasion to express one's belief and to answer largely, I do. That is, when put in the form of do you believe, it is asking the questions for which the affirmative answer is required, an act of belief. This is at the center. Nowadays, of course, it is also conjoined, especially at the Easter liturgy, with the Apostles' Creed. But it is intended to be a formulation and a filling out of those baptismal questions. In the other records of the Church from antiquity about what the conduct of baptism is, it is not only those 3 questions, but also a set of 3 questions about what we renounce. Do you renounce Satan? Do you renounce his service? Do you renounce his works? And equally, there is an I do that is expected. I do renounce them. That is, one must put aside any other beliefs that are contradictory to these beliefs. Specifically, a belief in Satan, or a belief somehow or other in his service, and a belief in any of his works, and instead a profession of one's faith in this. For the understanding of the Apostles' Creed and the origins of it, one must look to these ancient baptismal rituals which we still profess. Now, we think, of course, of baptism so often as the baptism primarily of the little ones, that is, of young children, and rightly so. I think it's very good that we continue to practice infant baptism. But, of course, at infant baptisms, as we experience it, or as the Church has ever experienced it, the children are not yet in the position to say, I do, to say, I believe, and hence the need of the parents and of the godparents to do this. But it is, even then, still a matter of an act of belief. We can indeed say that we were baptized. I presume that most people here were baptized as infants and don't remember the occasion. I must admit, I don't remember the occasion, although my mother used to tell me that the priest who baptized me was standing too close to a lit candle. The surplice caught on fire. He had to whip off the surplice. I don't remember it. Chaos as usual anywhere near where I go. All right. But the idea that I want to bring out is that this act of belief is so central to becoming a Christian. And then everything else that happens with a baptism follows from it. So we do say this is the moment at which one becomes a member of the church. We do say that this is the moment at which, if there was any actual sin, it is forgiven. We do say that it is the moment at which the stain and the blot and some of the effects of original sin begin to be healed, but are not completely healed. We do say that it is the moment of the entry of sanctifying grace. We do say that it is the moment in which there is a rebirth, that is, we are spiritually regenerated, a doctrine that we get especially from Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus. But all those things follow after the act of faith is made. That this is what is absolutely so central to it, and the act of faith that is required of a Christian is that it be an act of saying yes to belief in each of the three persons of the Trinity, whether it be done separately, as in those baptismal questions, or by the 4th or 5th century when it is put together in the form of the Apostles' Creed. There, I rely especially upon scholarly studies, and very interesting when one reads some of them. So I'm thinking in particular, and wanted very much to recommend to you, the book by Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, Introduction to Christianity. I'm not sure it's the kind of introduction that I'd put in the hands of someone who is looking for a very basic introduction. It's a more advanced account. But nonetheless, in his advanced account, what he is bringing out about the Apostles' Creed is that although in the West we have the tradition that associates it with the 12 apostles, in fact, according to one of the stories, the 12 lines of the Apostles' Creed were contributed by each one of the apostles. Not so sure that we can really maintain that historically, but it's a lovely story. I think it ought to be true if it isn't. But the notion is that this was really codified by the time of the 4th and the early 5th centuries. That is, an association in the West between what is contained here in this baptismal formula, now elaborated for communal liturgical use, and what the original doctrine of the apostles, what it is that they were teaching. But in doing so, that is, in associating it with the apostles, the Western Church struck out on a way in which the Western Church could really unify its ecclesial practices. As our dear Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, rewriting this, of course, earlier on in his life before he became Benedict XVI, as he tells us in his account of the Apostles' Creed, when it was presented to the Orthodox churches when they met at the Council of Florence, the Eastern Church did not know about the Apostles' Creed. That is, they did not have a tradition of recognizing this formula or some other particular set of things associated with the apostles. They did not know this and were surprised to hear it. They had other creedal formulas, so it's not that they lacked a creed, it's simply that they were not attending to this one. And hence what Ratzinger argues, and it's an interesting thing that you would find described here in greater detail if you wish to pursue the reading of it along with this course or independently, that what you found is that there is good reason to think that the Western Church, the church associated with Peter and with Paul in Rome, that played such an important part in unifying church practice around the confines of the Western Empire, used this particular formula as a way to recite what they all held in common. It was a source of unity of the various churches in the various lands in the early times. But I also find it interesting to think about the other claims that he explains here. Among other things, the way in which, for some people, it even came to be a kind of alienation. That is, there is a way in which, because it is connected with the political unification of the Western Roman Empire, that there's a way in which some people found it to be a little bit formulaic. Instead of it being the record of personal faith, it seems to transfer into the way in which you express your own common unity religiously and politically. Sidebar here for just a minute, because I want to stay with the main focus, but a brief sidebar. One of the things, of course, that is interesting is the relation between the church and our faith on the one hand, and politics on the other. Always an interesting topic. I mean, I think that one of these years I'd like to, although I'm not really yet prepared to do it well, and so I'll defer for just a little bit. But one of the things that I would like to think through and cover with you, perhaps in one of these ongoing sustained patterns of conversation, is the relation between church and state, between religion and politics, seen historically. Here, what I mean to suggest by it, and so not attempting to do all the modern permutations, not attempting to do the enormously complex relations between church and state at the end of the practice of Christendom, that is when Christianity is a juridical order, not trying to do any of that, but doing those initial centuries when we're dealing with the earliest parts of the church in Western Europe, the great evangelization efforts as the missionaries go forth into France, into Germany, eventually into the wonderful world of Poland and all the rest of the places where they go. The church provides for a way in which there is a unity of culture, and there is always a tendency to try to make it a political hegemony, just like it is a religious hegemony. But that the Western Church tries to resist this, that is, always has two separate hands. And you see this in Augustine, you see this in Gelasius, you see this in the various individuals who are associated with the relation of church and state. In the East, it is often amalgamated much tighter in a theocracy. Interestingly, in the West, one sees this practice of reciting a faith and not getting too theoretical about all of the necessary claims. In the East, you see a readiness to get extremely technical about the theoretical claims, and you see the rise of many more heresies. I mean, there's a very interesting correlation. I don't think I understand it all, but there's a very interesting correlation between the plural churches in the East, right, the many ways in which Orthodoxy has many different churches, and the way in which it was very, very hard to reconcile a person who had once become a heretic. Very hard to reconcile it. An insistence that one maintain this very, very strong set of elaborated beliefs, articulated very well, and the fact that confession didn't develop as a sacrament in anywhere nearly the same way. In the West, you have the strong development of the sacrament of penance very early on, and part of it is a way to readmit those who had lapsed. That is, you find even those who had lapsed under persecution, they had to give them a way to readmit. And so there was a very public kind of penance for the readmission in a way that didn't happen as spontaneously in the East. The West only came up with one notable heresy. It's called modalism, or Sabellianism, and it's the heresy. We'll have a chance to look at it as we go further into the Creed, but it's the heresy that doesn't really separate Father and Son and Holy Spirit. One still sees this in some curious ways, right? There was an episode, very complex, but I think I can summarize it in this way. There was an episode up in Boston a few years ago, back when Cardinal Law was still the Archbishop of Boston. And some people in certain churches, I won't mention, but if they happen to have the letters S.J. behind them, you might know. But there was an episode in some churches up there in which, for reasons of wanting to have gender sensitivity, they were baptizing people in the name of the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sanctifier. And the question was put to the Cardinal Archbishop, is that a valid Christian baptism? And the answer was, no way, Jose. And they made them rebaptize. That is, there is a typical Western inclination to say these are three just modes of divinity, and that there's a way in which there really isn't a separation of the persons. But rather, what we have to insist, that is what the reason for the initial questions that were put to someone who would be baptized, and the formulas of the church with respect to the community of the baptized is, do you believe in the Father? Do you believe in the Son? Do you believe in the Holy Spirit? There isn't a question, do you believe in the Trinity? Although the creeds would eventually work this out, and we find them saying that this is belief in one God. We'll get to that with the details. Let me turn to one other topic. I think we have time for perhaps one more, maybe two, before we finish tonight. It's the notion of I and we, and the notion of believe and know. So for the next 20 minutes or so, what I want to focus in on is that. First, I or we, and the answer is yes. That is, when we profess the Apostles' Creed, I must say I believe in one God. When we profess the Nicene Creed, we must say, I believe in one God. And I've asked to hand out the current translation of the Nicene Creed. For some years, from the Second Vatican Council's translations, or the translations after the Second Vatican Council, up until 2011, you will remember that we were saying we. Now, we went back to I, and part of the reason for going back to I is that the creeds are personal statements of belief. I must hold it, and with all due respect, I can't speak for you, and you can't speak for me. That is, we must each hold it, and so the formula needs to be an I, and so the Church went back to that. I think that there was an improvement, there was a return to what something's deeply important. But I don't mean to negate the we. As I said just a moment ago, in a, I hope, humorous way, is it I or is it we? The answer is yes. There is an extremely important aspect to understanding about the Creed, to understand what we're doing when we pray the Creed at baptism, what we do when we're praying the Creed, when we say the Rosary, what we're doing when we say the Creed as part of Mass. There's an extremely important part of we, in that together we want to say, each of us in our own name, I do this. And I believe that the importance of it comes from reflecting on what Jesus and what his disciples recorded for us in the Scriptures that are handing down for us as completely and accurately as possible what Jesus revealed. There is an extremely important aspect to hearing and to knowing by way of hearing. As you remember perhaps in Romans chapter 10, I had to write this one down, verse 17, chapter 10, 17, Paul communicates to us that what we know about our faith, we know by hearing. Faith is by hearing. And this is the we part of our singular I response. Let me be a little bit more clear. How is the faith passed on? Well, now admittedly, a given individual might get it by study. A given individual might find it by some circuitous route, personal experience, I admit. But the vast, vast, vast majority, following the directive of Christ and the apostles, get the faith by hearing. It's not by study. This is part of what I meant early on in my remarks tonight by saying that the faith is not a philosophy. In a way that I think Buddhism is a philosophy, and Lord knows there's lots of other philosophies, some of them even worth studying. Right? But that is what I try to do as a philosopher, even in practicing my métier there at the university, is to think about philosophy. And philosophy is definitely a matter of reading and studying. There were oral philosophers, the likes of Socrates, and Socrates was fascinating as an oral philosopher, continuing to poke questions in what you thought you believed until you eventually came to understand, I don't know what I thought I know. And his own wisdom consisted especially in not claiming to know what some people claimed to know and did not know. There's a way in which Socrates could practice his philosophy dialectically, and it's helpful when we who try to be professional philosophers or teachers of philosophy learn how to be truly dialectical and to engage in the conversation that gets people to reflect on what they know and what they don't. I love teaching epistemology. And I don't know that I've ever been in a discussion of politics that didn't turn out to be a discussion of epistemology. How do you claim to know what you claim to know? But that's not what our faith is. Our faith is a matter of hearing in this sense. It's a matter of hearing somebody else who believes. Our parents, hopefully our clergy, our teachers, one another in a congregation, but that faith is a matter of hearing, and what we're hearing is testimony. Now, let me step back for 1 minute before I return to that. I'll step back for 1 minute. This is the 1 minute epistemology course. Epistemology needs a little more than 1 minute, but here's the 1 minute version. I myself, personally in my own voice, think that probably the best definition of knowledge, the one that's going to work most often and most of the time, the best definition of knowledge is justified true belief. Now, that's a complicated subject. There's some problems with it. There's other kinds of knowledge. But I think it's probably the best one, right? Think of what belief is. It's assenting to something. True belief, right opinion, lucky guess, right? True belief, right opinion is when you've got the answer right, but it just happens to be the case. Whereas knowledge is justified true belief, right? So it's not just that I believe something. Lots of people believe crazy things. I'm not just talking about current politics. Lots of people believe true things. That's very nice. But it's only knowledge rather than mere opinion when we have justified true belief. I could argue that more. I'm going to take that as enough for the moment. What I want to focus on about that term, justified true belief, is the justified part. As I like to tell my students, I'm this semester teaching epistemology to the seminarians up in Stanford, great fun. What I like to tell them is that there are 4, and as far as I know, only 4, possible kinds of justification. Let me review them quickly. We could talk about it more in the questions if you want. One kind of justification is sensory evidence. I see it, I touch it, I taste it, I feel it for myself. Another kind of justification is an analytic proposition, self-evidence. That is, the content of the predicate is actually already latent in the content of the subject. So even if there are no circles, a circle is a closed geometrical figure equidistant from a common point in one plane. Even if there aren't any circles, that's what a circle is. A bachelor is an unmarried man, even if there aren't any. I won't comment on dating problems. All right. You have self-evidence, evidence. You can do a demonstration, that is, you can prove it either deductively or inductively. You can give a series or chain of arguments. That's a third way you get knowledge. So we've got evidence, self-evidence, demonstrations of various kind. The fourth possible justification for something that makes true opinion or true belief into justified true belief is testimony. The person who's offering you testimony has himself or herself seen or worked out the analytical deduction or done the demonstration. Maybe I haven't got any of those, but I trust somebody. It's in that regard that we know most of what we know in history. It's what we know most of what we know in many subjects, right? I mean, would that all of our budding young scientists had really done all the experiments that are recorded in their book. They take most of them on faith, I think. And I believe that it is heart and soul related to our faith. When I'm trying to talk about the faith to somebody, let's say my dear freshman after night court, or somebody on the subway, and I get into the craziest discussions on subways. But when I'm trying to talk about it, I think, and if the conversation turns in an epistemological direction, what I think we have to say is that our faith relies upon the real belief we have that Jesus rose from the dead. But I didn't see it. It's not an analytic proposition. It's not anything that I can demonstrate the way I can demonstrate lots of other things. It all relies upon the truth of what I have heard from my own teachers in the faith, who rely on what they, and it goes all the way back to the apostles. And it goes back to this kind of situation, I believe. Either Jesus really did rise or he did not rise. Let's suppose, for a minute, the contrary to what you and I believe. Suppose he didn't rise. I must admit, if they find the body, I'm out of here. Okay. But presuming that we really do believe that, let's assume for the minute that he did not rise from the dead. The apostles, their main job in life was to witness to the resurrection. So these guys, they had, whatever else they did, they had to witness that they had seen, first kind of justification, him rise from the dead. Now, if he didn't rise from the dead, they're either mistaken, or fools, or liars. I don't think there's too many more options, right? I mean, could they have been mistaken? Well, that's why I think that what we get in their accounts is, you need to touch the hands, come on up and touch them. You need to see me eat something. Yeah, that is, they really did see him dead, and it's inconceivable that they were mistaken, or at least I think the Gospels are attempting to present that. They weren't just crazy. I mean, we all know what a crazy person looks like. There's plenty of them, right? Okay. They weren't reported as crazy. I think the only other legitimate possibility, if they weren't crazy and if they weren't mistaken, is that they were liars. Now, when will somebody lie? I think you lie if you've something to gain from it. You might have something to gain because you're going to get out of a jam, or you might have something to gain from it if you're going to get money or sexual pleasure or power or prestige. But what St. Paul reminds us in Corinthians is these guys were willing to go to their death for saying that they saw something. This is, in a way, what makes their testimony credible, what makes them such powerful and compelling witnesses, namely, that if it really wasn't true, and if they knew it wasn't true, then they would be lying. But what in the world do they gain? The money, the sexual pleasure, the pride, the prestige? Do they gain life eternal? Well, if he didn't rise, they don't get life eternal either. There's no life eternal to get to, right? That is, they don't get anything for their lying, and yet they're willing to accept torture, suffering, and death. Anyway, you know this, but I bring it up from the point of view of saying the importance of hearing. That is, what we have to do is to ourselves encounter it, and we ourselves, especially if we were baptized at a young age, or maybe we've come to accept the faith later on, but we do it, and we've come to believe that there are credible witnesses all the way back, and we must say it with that same credibility. I think it is absolutely crucial when we're thinking about the Creed and understanding how all this works, that what it emerges from is a set of questions that are delivered orally, in which we must say it, and others will hear it, and that leading up to that act of answering the three questions in the positive, or saying the Apostles' Creed when we say it, what leads us up to it is the credibility of witnesses of people who also say it, and who pray it, and who live it. So that part of what we do when we say it, when we ourselves make these professions, is that we are called upon to say it, and to say it with conviction, and to understand it, at least as best we can understand, and to live what it leads us to and what it is that it requires. It's in this sense that I urge that for our last theme this evening, we think about the I and the we, and that we think about the hearing and the knowing. Because while there are things that we can know by study on our own, as when we approach something philosophically or in any of the other specialized disciplines, we are, in those specialized disciplines, I think, we are pursuing either something that we see for ourselves, understand for ourselves, can prove for ourselves. I mean, dealing with students at the university, as I love to do, what you see them doing in their various majors is to learn for themselves why the claims that are made in their subject areas are so compelling. When you talk to I live among the freshmen, and when you talk to the freshmen, it's so charming. And yet they don't really have a command on it. Whereas by the time you get to when they're juniors or seniors, okay, they're not with doctorates yet, but they know why they hold the various things they do. There's a very fascinating thing about the ones when they learn the science, when they learn the mathematics, when they learn whatever discipline they're doing, and they get good enough to be able to explain this. Many of them, however, have thought their faith irrelevant. Many of it have thought now the things they're professing are just an antiquated part of tradition, a matter of superstition, a matter of something that belongs to a different generation than their own, and hence the need to be constantly reminding them and to living it. It is why I think that the scandals are so horrendous, because they see people whom they respect as saying something, not living it. And so it seemed like so many of the other things that you hear without the person who is saying it really believing it. Hence, what I want to urge is that the Church has long recognized the incredible importance of faith being passed on by hearing, but hearing someone say it who does it with credibility. Hence, I'm so delighted that you are here and that we together, these course of lectures, will be able to understand better and better what these claims are. Let me ask you to just turn your eyes on the page for just a minute and sum up what I'm saying and make one last new claim before we take our break. In summing up what I'm saying, I ask you to notice here about the Nicene Creed, how it is and has been restored to being in the first person, something that I myself assert. Next week, when we're together, good Lord willing, we'll talk especially about that first paragraph and all the things that are contained in it, for there are a vast number contained in just those few words. The long second paragraph we'll give several weeks to, because it is focused on all the interesting things about Christ, and there especially is where we get the account that needs to be understood, these various matters of doctrine and dogma, especially about some of the things the Church has come to understand about Jesus. And then in the third paragraph, some things about the Holy Spirit. But I wanted to direct your attention for just a minute to the fact that the Creed ends with a belief in forgiveness. I believe in one holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church. I confess one baptism for the forgiveness of sins, and I look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. And interestingly, of all the things that you could have said, the thing that the Church has rightly emphasized in our creedal statements is that we believe in forgiveness. I think it's one of the hardest things on the practical order to believe in, and it's one of the parts of the world that, it seems to me, most parts of the world have no way to encompass. That is, in other religious traditions, where this is not mentioned or discussed, let alone made such an important part, there is a great difficulty in even undertaking and to appreciate the wrongdoing, or there is a rather serious exclusion. In our order of politics, there is no easy principle of forgiveness. People get embarrassed and exiled, confined to the scrap heaps of history, but no easy way of a pattern of forgiveness. Part of what it is that is needed in the Christian is that belief in all these things, and a belief in it as one of the central things that is our relation to God. It is a part, I think, so much of our prayers, and at least as one, when I hear confessions, you hear that as much as anything else. The difficulty of forgiving and the difficulty of really living in accordance with what I would like to do. And yet the way we say it, whether in the Lord's Prayer or whether we say it here in the prayer that is the Creed, when we say it in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It is one of those absolutely curious phrases in the Lord's Prayer when we're asking God for something, but we are the ones conditioning the way we receive it on the way in which we bestow it. And then when we profess our faith, that this is among the final one or two items that we mention, that in a way it is so unbelievable, and yet it is at the heart of what it is that we believe. And hence, among the things that are most inclined to make this credible is when we can bestow the act of forgiveness ourselves, doing so mindful that this will be absolutely crucial to how we receive it. For tonight, I hope enough. Next week, when we come together, we can stay, of course, for questions as we always do. But next week, when we're together, I'll try to concentrate on those first couple of lines. If you decide you'd like to read this along with me, I will be referring to it. You don't have to, but it's a wonderful book. And he organizes it especially according to the Apostles' Creed, but with lots of references to the Nicene Creed. I'll also make regular reference to the Catechism. And as you know, it's covered in the very first quarter of the Catechism. After an initial account of what some of the basic terms mean, then there is a line-by-line review of the lines of the Creed, and so this will also, I think, prove very helpful. Thank you.